All right, so the battlefield. So let's take a look at the battlefield sort of as a whole, kind of the anatomy of the battlefield, so to speak. So here's sort of a fairly simple battlefield setup. It's designed to be a straight and sort of direct encounter where the player is sort of forced to take down the enemy directly in order to get to a goal behind them. So the player enters, the door locks behind them, they wander out into this preamble space, and which allows them to sort of take in the combat arena for a moment and sort of view the space that they're going to be strategically moving through. Then the enemies enter. The preamble space has very little in the way of strategic opportunities, cover, and so on, so the player sort of moves forward based on the fact that the enemy is not here yet, and this is a lot more advantageous to be in than back here, so they move forward into what we might call the player territory, which is sort of the player-controlled area. So this is an area sort of designed to keep the player to give the player sort of a comfortable start to a combat encounter and to keep them from falling back into the preamble space. We want to force them to sort of stay here and have to deal with the threat that's coming against them. So we can call what the enemies are in, essentially the area that they control, as the enemy territory. This is the area that we want to get into, but the enemy has a lot of advantages there because they're already entrenched there. They've got advantageous sort of cover positions. And then we've got this sort of negative space between the enemy and player controlled territories we call a dead zone or a kill zone. So this is a space that is lacking in any sort of cover protection. It's kind of a negative space, and so crossing it is a big risk for both the enemy and the player. So we sort of get in a situation where the enemies sort of hunker down and sort of shoot back and forth, but now we sort of need to sort of force the player to move and to make some decisions. We want the enemies to advance on the player in order to pressure them and get them to sort of make some interesting decision making. So this battlefield right here has a single dominant front vector, as you can see right here, but along the sides you see how like the front vector I sort of like have drawn in how sort of these cover positions sort of allow for horizontal movement here, and it kind of continues up here and here, and essentially these sort of lines that I've kind of drawn in kind of approximate how the cover sort of supports occluded movement through the space. So as you can see, on the sides we have these secondary front direction, which is perpendicular here, that allows occluded movement forward along the front vector, and so these are the flank positions. So on the right, what I'd call the primary flank, movement is fairly protected. We've got this large like high cover position right here, high cover object right here. Movement is fairly protected and occluded, so the player might have trouble even seeing if an enemy is advancing on them until it's way too late. And so on the left-hand side over here, we've got another flank route, and because it's somewhat less occluded, it's less dominant than this one, I've called it the secondary flank. And then as we get into enemy territory, you can kind of see, if we compare sort of the cover and how it's arranged and shape up here as compared to the player territory and how a lot of the cover is up here, it's getting a lot more sort of square and supportive of more than one front direction, and that's because I anticipate as the fight comes to an end, the player has advanced sort of deep into enemy territory, and since they're not dead yet, they have most likely killed most of the other enemies, and if they're sort of having a last stand with a final enemy or two, and sort of at that point the front vector is sort of fallen apart because we sort of have the player is mastering the space and all the threats, so the front vector becomes a little less important at that sort of stage of the encounter. So if you're interested in reading more about this type of combat setup right here, I definitely recommend an article by Z. Peters called The Art of War, Gears of War, looking at the Knock Knock encounter from Gears of War 1. I've put a link for it in the lecture notes, so I definitely recommend checking it out. So